My subject tonight, as you know, is Oedipus and the death of tragedy. But Oedipus you all know quite a lot, in some ways perhaps too much, so that it may be necessary for me to say what kind of Oedipus I'm going to talk about. The Oedipus I will talk about is the Oedipus of Sophocles' first Oedipus play. As many of you know, Sophocles wrote two plays about Oedipus, one of them Oedipus Tyrannus, sometimes translated Oedipus the King, and the other one Oedipus at Colonus. And I will be talking about the Oedipus of the first Oedipus play, of the Oedipus Tyrannus, Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the King. I will talk about that first and then go from there to the problem of the death of tragedy. One of the things that I want to say about the Oedipus of that play seems to me to have relevance far beyond that particular play. And indeed, many of the things that I hope to say, I think have some applicability and meaning also for people who don't seem to perhaps remember that play very well. I suppose some of you know it awfully well, some of you perhaps not so well, and that doesn't matter so much. Of course, if you should feel stimulated in that case by this lecture to then go and read the play, that would be marvelous. Some people suppose that there was a real Oedipus, and that may well be the case. I'm agnostic about that. I won't take any stand about that, but he was a historical figure. He may well have been. And some people further suppose that somehow certain things really happened to him, such as all the things that Sophocles relates, and then some. Well, there are difficulties about that. For one thing, I think there are many people who suppose, misled by certain publishers and translators, that Sophocles wrote a trilogy about Oedipus, which he did not. That's just plain a mistake. Some people suppose that there are three plays, the two that I've mentioned, and the Antigone, and that Sophocles wrote them one after the other to be performed together, but that's not so. Sophocles wrote, according to tradition, 120 plays, and among these are the Antigone, which was first performed about 442 BC, and then Oedipus Rex, which was first performed about 425 BC, quite a long time later, as part of quite a different trilogy. And then the last play he wrote before he died in 406 BC was the Oedipus Colonus, which again was conceived as part of yet another trilogy. These three plays don't particularly belong together. The figure of Oedipus, insofar as it appears or is referred to in these three plays, isn't necessarily very much the same person. There are examples of, for instance, Odysseus appearing in two of Sophocles' extant seven tragedies and being an utterly different character in the two in which he appears, namely the Ajax and the Philoctetes, immensely admirable in one, loathsome in the other. So we mustn't assume that somehow we get on the installment plan in various plays of Sophocles real-life reports on a character named Oedipus. In addition to that, there were at least 12 Greek playwrights who wrote about Oedipus and who saw him quite differently. And we often forget that Greek playwrights enjoyed enormous freedom in what they did with their characters. And if they wrote several plays on the same one, which they all did, as I said, Sophocles wrote 120 plays. Euripides may not have written quite that many, but we have about 19 of his. And he dealt several times with the same material. Sometimes they dealt with the same material in a very, very different way. And when we take the way that the major Greek playwrights, and a lot of minor ones as well, dealt with the same characters, then we get a wealth of different traditions. And there's the rub. Oedipus was a person, a hero of the mythical period, about whom there were all sorts of stories, and the playwright was quite free to choose and invent in making up his play about such a figure. Now, I don't want to make this point at any very great length, but perhaps there is a way of making it a little more vividly, a little more concretely than I've made it so far by reading you a passage from Homer's Odyssey, which of course is somewhat earlier than Sophocles. And here Odysseus descends into the netherworld and makes the following report. Then I saw Oedipus' mother. This is from Homer's Odyssey. Then I saw Oedipus' mother, the beautiful Epicaste, whose great deed, committed unwittingly, it was to marry her own son, who, having slain his own father, married her. And straightway the gods made it known among men. Straightway the gods made it known among men. But he remained in dearest Thebes and ruled the Cadmeans, suffering sorrows in line with the deadly designs of the gods, while he descended beyond the strong bolted gates of Hades, plunging down in a noose from a lofty rafter, overpowered by grief. But for him she left infinite sufferings, forged by a mother's furies. You will notice that there are certain differences from the Oedipus story, the way you are most likely to remember it. One, the gods made it known straightway, which suggests that there couldn't have been any children. The gods made it known straightway after the marriage, and she straightway committed suicide. And indeed, the children don't appear before the great tragic poets. The children don't appear before Aeschylus and Sophocles. That is their invention, or their picking up some tradition that wasn't as old as Homer. And then secondly, it is quite clearly said here that he stayed on as a ruler of the Cadmeans. He was not exiled from the city. And then we get in the Iliad a report of the great funeral games that were performed when Oedipus died in battle, an old man. All this is quite different. And the point then that I want to make here is how free Sophocles was to shape this material. One other reference along that line, in a fragment that we have of an Oedipus play by Euripides, Sophocles' younger contemporary, Oedipus is blinded not by his own hands, but by the servants of his father Laius. And you will agree with me, those of you who have some literary sensitivity, that the effect of that would be quite different to his blinding himself. In other words, Sophocles was a man of enormous originality, as were Aeschylus and Euripides, and his Oedipus is a very distinctive character who is remarkably different from any Oedipus to be found before him, and I would say also quite different in some respects from any Oedipus found after that. Now, the play, the Oedipus Tyrannus, Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the King, is, to my mind, and this is one of my few very uncontroversial remarks this evening, a very, very great play indeed, but that a lot of people agree. My admiration for it, as you will shortly see, is based on somewhat different reasoning, on a somewhat different approach from that of a lot of other people. But it still is true that since the play is so great and so rich, one could easily talk about it for a whole semester. And if I want to talk about it tonight as part of one lecture, obviously I have to limit myself to, well, let us say, one dimension of it. I distinguish in my approach to literature, including this play, three dimensions, without wanting to lay it down as a rule that there can be only three and no more. But there are at least these three. One of these that I don't want to talk about very much is the historical dimension. To some slight extent, actually, I have just been talking about it, but this is all I will say about it, placing the thing in historical context and understanding it as a historical document. Secondly, and this may conceivably distress one or the other of you, I will not discuss tonight very much the artistic dimension of the play. Now, that's how one usually, I think, discusses such matters in literature courses. One traces imagery, and if one knows the original language, perhaps one also goes into the diction, into the meters, into all kinds of niceties of the artistry. Even discussions of the plot and the great plot mastery that Sophocles showed in writing this play would belong within the artistic dimension. Now, what I want to say is I don't deny for a moment that there are these dimensions. On the contrary, they are there, they're terribly important, and the artistic dimension is what usually gets discussed in connection with this play. But what I want to concentrate on in my relatively few remarks about the play is a third dimension, which interests me particularly, not only because I happen to be a professor of philosophy, but because it seems to me that it is quite generally one of the most remarkable aspects of great works of art, and one that is often neglected or not handled too well. This is the philosophical dimension. I think major works of art usually have such a dimension, at least very often do, and certainly this play does. And insofar as I'm now going to discuss this play, I will limit myself to the philosophical dimension and mention 5 points within that, again without claiming that they're only these 5, but they're at least these 5, and they're all, I think, interesting and important. Now, I'm not talking about what Oedipus was really like. I'm talking about what Sophocles made of this story in his play. And the first thing that comes through to me as I read the play, or as I see the play performed, and I'm not sure whether there's any play that I've seen performed more often, maybe Twelfth Night, I'm not sure, but I've seen this play performed very, very often in stunningly different ways, often quite badly. And one of the striking things is that it's one of those plays that I find overpowering, even when it's performed rather badly. I'm sure it can be performed so badly that it is not a gripping experience at all. But even if it is not performed too terribly well, it's still an overwhelming experience. Now, one thing that gets through to me, and this is the first aspect of the philosophical dimension, is man's radical insecurity. What I mean to say about it is that I find that in this play, and I assume that it's in this play because that is one of the things that the playwright felt. I'm not saying necessarily as a general rule that if the playwright felt something, and I also find it in the play, that I find it in the play because he consciously decided to put it in there. But in the case of Sophocles, I think there's evidence that he was such a highly intelligent and self-conscious artist that probably these various things that I find in the play he was also quite aware of. But that is secondary. I think he was aware of these things, but even if he wasn't, that's not what particularly matters. What matters is that they are to be found in the play. Now, how does one find the radical insecurity? I think if you stop to think about it, I just have to remind you of it. It is so obvious that I can be extremely brief about it. We are told near the beginning of the play that Oedipus is the first of men, and then in the end we see him absolutely undone, almost finished, utterly destroyed. And what is suggested to us very, very forcibly is that even the first of men, even the person who seems to be above all others, may suffer a horrible fall very, very suddenly. Some people might suppose, and such readers of the play have not been lacking, that the reference to Oedipus as the first of men might possibly be ironical. Well, one might ask, first of all, was Sophocles ever ironical? To that the answer is yes, indeed, and quite especially in this play. There are many things that are very ironical. This, I think, is not ironical. Now, how can I tell? Is this just authority against authority? Indeed, it is my authority, you might say, against a much greater authority, namely that of Aristotle. Aristotle laid it down as a rule that the hero of tragedy should be a person who is not too outstanding and not too tiny either, but somebody in between. This, I think, is one of the sillier things that Aristotle ever said. I say one of the sillier things, perhaps with some misgiving, because he had read more than 7 of Sophocles' plays. I know only 7. Only 7 have survived to our time, but in Aristotle's time there were more. But he did admire Oedipus so much that one might have thought that he would have noticed that Oedipus was not a middling character. Now it so happens that if we look at the other plays that survive by Sophocles, none of them are about middling characters. This theme that the hero is the first of men we get again and again. In the case of Antigone, it was Hegel, the German philosopher, who said that she was the most glorious human being ever to have stepped on the earth, which I suppose was meant to be a dig at Jesus Christ, but let's not go into that. In any case, Antigone is certainly no middling character. She certainly is, to put it more diplomatically, one of the most glorious human beings ever to have lived. Of Ajax, the hero of another Sophoclean tragedy, we are told explicitly, as we are of Heracles in the Women of Trachis and of the Electra, that nobody as noble as that, or nobody nobler than that, has ever lived. So Sophocles goes out of his way to serve notice on us that his heroes and heroines are about as noble as anybody ever has been. And then he shows us how this noble person, who is eminent over everybody, who is wiser than anybody, is utterly undone. I don't think this point needs laboring particularly if some of the other things I say should be more controversial, that there is this theme of man's radical insecurity in this play and in the other plays of Sophocles, I think is so obvious that I better go on to the next point. The next point is that Oedipus Tyrannus is a play about human blindness. Now, if you take that in the most literal, physical sense, again, this is utterly obvious, and so obvious that it would be silly even to mention it, but I take it that his eventual blindness, when he blinds himself, is symbolic. He has been so blind all along, and when he finally sees, he blinds himself. Now, this human blindness is again a somewhat general condition. You see, this play has had an enormous appeal. Aristotle thought that was a paradigmatic tragedy, as great a tragedy as any ever written, and lots of people have thought so ever since, Sigmund Freud in more recent times, and attempts have not been lacking to find in Oedipus somehow something representative of all of us. What I'm suggesting is that, first of all, it is the radical insecurity of the human condition that terrifies us, that speaks to us. And secondly, that Oedipus is not the only one who is blind, but that we are supposed to realize how blind we are. And quite especially how blind we are in our relationships to the people who are closest to us, who love us the most and whom we love the most. That is, to be very concrete, our parents, our children, and our wives and husbands. This is, of course, all these relationships on display, that he is particularly blind vis-à-vis his father and his mother and his wife, who also happens to be his mother, and his children, not really realizing who they are. Now, one can in literature deal with all sorts of human relationships, but it is really not particularly surprising that such a large percentage of the plays and novels that have moved the most people most deeply deal with human relationships in which all of us have some share. The Oresteia, Hamlet, Lear, Othello, the brothers Karamazov, Anna Karenina, again and again they deal with human relationships that we know too at first hand, and they somehow terrify us by what they tell us about these relationships. And Oedipus preeminently, more so perhaps than any other single work of literature, makes this point very, very powerfully, how blind even the wisest are likely to be when it comes to the people closest to them. Here again, I will say something unkind about Aristotle. Those of you who recall Aristotle's Poetics will know that in his Poetics he makes a great deal of recognition. But his discussion of recognition is, I think, at the most superficial and the most trivial level imaginable. Namely, the kind of situation where, let us say, in a number of Greek tragedies, Electra and Orestes don't immediately recognize each other, and then eventually the recognition is brought about, and Aristotle compares the devices that are used to bring about this recognition. But there is surely another much more profound sense, much more shattering sense that meets the eyes in Oedipus as to a recognition being something that is not just on that level, of suddenly understanding, of suddenly really perceiving what one's relationship is to other people to whom one has not really understood one's relationship at all. Now, we don't find that only in Oedipus. We find that also in Euripides' Bacchae. We find that also in Euripides' Hippolytus, where Theseus doesn't understand this kind of relationship. We find it in Euripides' Medea, where Jason doesn't understand this sort of relationship. We find it in Aeschylus' Agamemnon. We find it many times once we have been alerted to it, but still there is one locus classicus for the whole thing, and that is the Oedipus Tyrannus of Sophocles, which is preeminently the tragedy of human blindness. Thirdly, still speaking of the philosophical dimension of the same play, it is a play that deals with what I call the curse of honesty. When I speak of the curse of honesty, I do so as one who highly values and admires honesty, who thinks, as Hamlet does, that to be an honest man is most exceptional and something not to be taken for granted, but who also realizes, as I say Sophocles does, that about honesty there's something very problematic, that it is accompanied by a curse. In other words, that honesty is not, in the obvious sense, the best policy, as if it also made you happy. On the contrary, honesty alienates you from other people. Now, how so in this play? I take it that one of the striking features of Oedipus as conceived by Sophocles, but not as he was conceived before Sophocles, is that he is outstanding in his honesty. This is one of several innovations by Sophocles. This was not part of the story before him, certainly not a prominent part at all, but with Sophocles it becomes central. What Sophocles does in the first place is something quite stunning. The way his play starts must have been absolutely startling to his audience. In the first place, the play starts, and I'll have something more to say about that in just a moment. It starts with people dying of the plague. That in Athens in 425 must have been a traumatic experience to see on the stage, because 4 years earlier the plague had swept Athens, and there must have been few people in the audience who had not lost close relatives and friends to the plague, and they all knew that the man who was the first of men, Pericles, their ruler, their leader, had been killed by the plague. Here are people killed by the plague, and Oedipus is determined to find out what causes the plague. This had not been part of any story before. This tying it in with the plague was entirely Sophocles' invention, his originality, and to make the crux of the whole agone, of the whole contest of it, Oedipus' attempt to get at the truth and to find all the tragic conflicts, to find all the tragic collisions by people trying to oppose his quest to find out the truth. In other words, to structure the whole thing around a quest for honesty, that was original with Sophocles. And what he suggests to us is that here is a person who seeks for honesty, who wants to find out what the truth is, and other people oppose him, and he has no patience for them. He thinks they're despicable and contemptible for trying to thwart him. For instance, Tiresias the seer tells him that it is no good to try so hard to find the truth, that it won't make him happy, and Oedipus feels that it is just unbelievable that somebody should think about honesty in these terms. When Tiresias tells him that wisdom is terrible, and I quote, when it brings no profit to the man that's wise, Oedipus has all the contempt for that, let us say, a Nietzsche might have for a hedonist, sort of, why should it bring me profit? I want the truth, whether it makes me happy or not. And again he is warned by other people to stop looking for the truth, and he just cannot understand this kind of hedonistic attitude. He wants the truth. That is original with Sophocles. And he is told again and again, this won't make you happy, and he feels that is not relevant at all. And of course it does destroy him at the end of this tragedy, but that's no reason for hesitating at all. And we are also told that earlier, once in Corinth, somebody taunted him, a man who was drunk, and Oedipus wouldn't rest till he had got to the truth of the matter. In other words, so concerned was he to find out what might be the truth, and so impatient with people who would not share this ethos. At this point, if you listen to me in a very critical spirit, as you should, you might wonder whether there isn't the danger, it's a perennial danger, that the interpreter or critic carries into a play that he likes and admires very much his own concerns. I think this is something that one should always watch out for. And so one should ask oneself, first of all, isn't this an anachronism? Isn't this kind of concern with truth that leaves no stone unturned and tries to get to the truth of the matter a relatively modern development? Well, there's a passage in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War where he expresses his contempt for people who readily accept the truth that is offered them and who do not take pains to find out the real truth of the matter. Just exactly the ethos that I here ascribe to Sophocles. Well, all right, so it's not an anachronism, but what right do we have to find this in Sophocles? Well, I mention this because it's an important methodological point. When one reaches a point like the one I have just reached now, I think one should say, well, we have 7 of his plays. Is this something that we find in any of the others? And the answer is we do indeed find it in some of the others as well, for instance in the Women of Trachis. But the most striking example is that there is one other myth in which this concern with honesty has absolutely no place whatsoever before Sophocles, and he once again structures his whole tragedy around this very same concern with honesty, and that is his play Philoctetes, which originally has nothing to do with honesty, but the way Sophocles constructs his plot, it's all about Neoptolemus being terribly concerned about honesty, and Odysseus wants him to tell lies in order to save the Greeks, and Neoptolemus has great qualms of conscience about being dishonest even if it means saving his people. So it seems to me obvious that this was not just my thing, but Sophocles' thing too. He was deeply concerned about it, as I think I have shown. After man's radical insecurity and human blindness and the curse of honesty, fourthly, and I have 5 major points that I want to stress, Sophocles makes of Oedipus Tyrannus a play about a tragic situation. Most interpreters of this play just plain fail to see that. To the extent to which they fail to see it, it seems to me they obviously don't understand the play very well. I'm not saying that there's only one way of reading such a play. Maybe there are many ways. But if one leaves this out, it seems to me that one leaves out one of the most important things about it. And most interpreters, for some strange reason, leave out the plague. Some of them try to rationalize this terrible and disabling shortcoming by saying that Sophocles himself doesn't say very much about the plague after the beginning. But as I have just suggested to you, this was such a traumatic thing for his audience, which only 4 years before had lost their families, had lost their friends to the plague, that they didn't need to be reminded in such a short play every few minutes again of the plague. And the way the whole plot is set up is the plague will not stop until we find out who murdered the king, Laius. And so, if Oedipus at any point gives up the quest to look for the murderer of Laius, then his people will keep dying of the plague, which is terrible, and which would be irresponsible of him, and which would mean that he is not a good king. If, on the other hand, in order to save his people, he keeps looking for the truth, he will destroy his wife and mother Jocasta and himself and bring deep unhappiness upon his children as well, who were born of such a monstrous union, of a union that the Greeks considered so monstrous. So he is in a tragic situation. Whatever he does, great suffering will come about. There is no way out. The difference is that one way, the one he chooses, is the way of integrity, but integrity that leads to tragic complications, and the other way, which also would lead to tremendous suffering, is devoid of integrity. Such tragic situations as this one are not found in all tragedies. They are found in quite a few, and Oedipus is one of these. Finally, fifthly, and don't forget, I still have to say something about the death of tragedy. Fifthly, winding up with the philosophical dimension of this play, it is a play about justice. It is a play that airs, or that communicates, airs is not the right way, that communicates, perhaps in a subliminal way, perhaps in a way that doesn't rise to the consciousness of everybody in the audience at all, deep doubts about justice. Now, I confess here again, of course, I have ears to hear because I have deep doubts about justice. And as Professor Wareham mentioned, I have written a book, Without Guilt and Justice, because I have such profound misgivings about justice. So there is indeed, once again, the possibility that perhaps I read my own concerns into the play, but it's also possible that I have ears to hear something that's in there that other people who have never questioned justice simply refuse to hear because they think it would be too horrible. Now, how so? How can this be a play that raises doubts about justice? Well, the big question that first of all arises is, does Oedipus in some sense deserve the horrible things that happen to him? He is utterly undone. Has he done anything so evil? And to this, I think, Many of you probably would answer. I'm not trying to put you all in one bag. No doubt you have different ideas. But many of you would probably say, well, as for sleeping with his mother, we are certainly told that he didn't realize that she was that. And so on that score, in a way, morally, he was innocent, even if in the eyes of the gods he was not. But some of you will say, while he didn't know that the man he killed was his father, he still did kill a man, and isn't that bad enough, even if he didn't know that it was his father? This, I think, is terribly anachronistic thinking. He was a contemporary of Theseus, and if you don't know much about that particular age, the heroic age of Greece, I hope that some of you have read The King Must Die, or The Bull from the Sea by Mary Renaud, who succeeds better than people who write historical novels usually do in bringing to life that time, that age, that ethos. And then you will know that for a man to stand up single-handed to monsters or groups of people who attack him, that was considered rather remarkable and rather praiseworthy. And if somebody was enough of a hero, he did that often enough and killed enough people during a lifetime that it wouldn't deeply imprint itself in his mind, and he wouldn't remember all this very well. I dare say that Sophocles himself must have been very impatient with this particular line of reasoning, that Oedipus really had done something very bad, and so in his second Oedipus play, which he wrote at the very end of his life, I think he himself sort of indulges in an outburst against interpreters of that sort. Here, Oedipus rebukes Creon, who says, "You did, after all, kill a man," and he says as follows, and this is very sarcastic. It's not quite the way many people picture the supposedly mellow Sophocles. He says, and here, as in all the passages I've read so far, the translation is mine and rather literal. He says to Creon, "Just tell me one thing I would like to know. If someone tried right here and now to kill you who are so righteous, would you ask the slayer if he was possibly your father, or strike back straightway? As you love your life, I'm sure you would strike back the culprit and not look around first for a warrant. And to this plight the gods thrust me, and if my father came to life again, I know that he would bear me out." We get a description about how the old man brought his knotted staff down on the head of Oedipus, who flared up in anger and killed him and the lot of his attendants, except one, of course, who got away and bore the tale. So I think we are, first of all, made to feel that he did not deserve any terrible fate for having done that. And so this is one thing that we are made to wonder about. But then, if you think that this is still perhaps a little dubious, consider next Oedipus' great curse. And this I will read in another translation. Professor Wareham brought me just a few minutes ago. And it is the great curse that Oedipus pronounces early in the play Oedipus Tyrannus against the murderer of Laius. And he says, and of course it is, as the audience knows, he himself who did it. But here is what he says. "No one shall give this murderer shelter. No one shall speak to him. No one shall let him share in sacrifice or prayer or lustral rites. The door of every house is barred against him. The God has shown me that he is polluted, so by this edict I ally myself with Phoebus and the slain. As for the slayer, whether he had accomplices or not, this is my solemn prayer concerning him. May evil come of evil. May he live a wretched life and meet a wretched end. And as for me, if I should knowingly admit him as a member of my household, may the same fate which I invoked for others fall upon me." It seems to me that when you hear these words, you're bound to be terrified. You're bound to ask yourself in your guts, if not in your brain, whether he is not rather rash, and whether this kind of justice is really so just, and whether, if one puts oneself really in the shoes of the person who has done it, etc., etc. It calls into question the whole desire to punish. And if you feel that when he wants to punish Tiresias and Creon, doesn't know all the facts, well, that's of course one of the problems with justice, with human justice, that it doesn't know all the facts. And we ask ourselves, is Jocasta's self-punishment her suicide? Is Oedipus' self-punishment his blinding himself just? And I think these doubts about justice we also find in Aeschylus' Oresteia and Prometheus, and we also find them frequently in Euripides. I think they are one of the central themes of Greek tragedy, but we find them very, very prominently in Oedipus. In other words, what I'm saying is that these 5 points that I have made are found in other great works of literature too, but Oedipus Tyrannus is paradigmatic, is a model in all of these respects. So I agree with Aristotle and generations who have come after him that Oedipus is as great a tragedy as any, but for very different reasons. Aristotle, after all, never got beyond plot construction, and that seems to me really rather superficial, to be confronted with a play like Oedipus Tyrannus and to notice nothing about it except the skillful construction of the plot. But in case you think that I have not paid attention to that, I will say in concluding my remarks about Oedipus, the plot is indeed a masterpiece. Now, what does all this have to do with the death of tragedy? Quite a lot. The person who has given us the concept of the death of tragedy is the same person who has given us the phrase, the death of God, namely Nietzsche. And it seems to me that Nietzsche's talk and that of a lot of others who more recently have repeated his half-baked ideas about the death of tragedy really amounts to the following, and I'm not oversimplifying too greatly. What these people have in mind is that after Oedipus Tyrannus, not too many tragedies very much like Oedipus Tyrannus were written anymore. And indeed, about 20 years later, a year after Sophocles and Euripides had died, no tragedies quite like that were written anymore for a very long time indeed. Now this, I think, is true. But what should occur to one, what might have occurred to Nietzsche, was a professor of classical philology and knew Latin and Greek much better than I shall ever know either, is that not one of Aeschylus or Sophocles' earlier tragedies that we know is at all very similar to Oedipus Tyrannus. It really stands rather by itself in a very small company. Indeed, most Greek tragedies, certainly the ones earlier than this one, don't even have a hero. Many of you suppose that a tragedy, of course, must have a tragic hero, but most Greek tragedies don't really have a hero. This one, the one I've talked about, most emphatically does. If you look at earlier ones, you might say, well, Eteocles in the Seven Against Thebes, and maybe Orestes in the second play of the Oresteia are heroes, and maybe Prometheus in the play named after him, and that's it. That would be at most 3 heroes out of the 7 plays of Aeschylus. But these plays were really part of something much larger, namely connected trilogies, which Aeschylus wrote and Sophocles did not. And in this larger scope, there wasn't a single hero, but at most a person who dominated one of the 3 plays, if that. And in Prometheus, where you might say, well, in that play, certainly the action is dominated by one figure, we notice an episodic quality and not a tautly, tightly constructed plot at all. And the kind of unity of plot constructed around one hero and his fall that we find in the Oedipus Tyrannus is most exceptional. We don't find it in Sophocles' Ajax. We don't find it in his Antigone. And I think the first play in which we do find it is the Medea of Euripides in 431 BC. And I defy anyone to find it in any extant play that is earlier than that. It is, I think, futile to argue whether before the Medea there was perhaps another play in which we find a tight action that is constructed around one hero the way the Medea was. Of the plays that have survived, this is the first one that fits. And this, of course, has a woman for a heroine. It is rather ironical, seeing that Nietzsche blamed Euripides for the death of tragedy, that tragedy in the sense in which Nietzsche writes about it was actually heavily indebted to Euripides. He was the one who invented this type of tragedy, which reached its perfection in Oedipus Tyrannus. But then again, we don't find it in Sophocles' Women of Trachis, in his Philoctetes, in his Oedipus on Colonus, or in his Ajax and Antigone. Only of his later plays, again, in his Electra. That's the only other play with that kind of a very tight plot construction built around a single hero. In other words, in 2 out of Sophocles' 7 plays, and in none of Aeschylus. And we do find it in a few of Euripides. But one thing I want to impress on you in this connection is how heterogeneous Greek tragedy was. Not all Greek tragedies were tall like Oedipus Tyrannus. I admire it vastly. I've given you some reasons why I admire it so much. But that doesn't mean that all the other tragedies were very much like it at all. On the contrary, one of the startling things about Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides is their enormous inventiveness and originality. It is astonishing how little they repeated themselves and how many different types of tragedy they created instead of repeating the same formula over and over again. The Bacchae, for example, the Trojan women are very, very different kinds of things, and so again as the Alcestis, the Ion, and so forth. So when Nietzsche blames the death of tragedy on Euripides, I would say Euripides did as much as anyone to fashion this particular type of tragedy. Moreover, I think when Nietzsche thinks that tragedy then died, he assumes that what belongs with tragedy, and so do modern writers about the death of tragedy assume, that what belongs to tragedy is naturally a tragic conclusion. If it doesn't end in catastrophe, many of you will say it's not a tragedy. But most Greek tragedies did not end tragically. And if you want to say, well, then they weren't tragedies, you can redefine the terms all you want to, but I would say, well, if the Greeks call the things that Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides called tragedies, why should we say that these things weren't tragedies? The Oresteia ends with the Eumenides with hallelujah choruses, anything but tragically. It ends absolutely ecstatically in a triumphant celebration. The Prometheus trilogy apparently ended in the same sort of way. Aeschylus generally seems to have ended on this kind of upbeat. And if you turn to Sophocles, his Philoctetes ends happily, his Oedipus at Colonus ends happily, on an upbeat, on salvation. His Electra ends on a note of triumph. His Ajax does commit suicide at line 805, and then most of the remaining 555 lines, in other words, the second half of the play, deal with the question of whether he is or is not to receive a hero's burial, and in the end he does. So it doesn't end in catastrophe, but in his getting the hero's burial. In other words, of Sophocles' 7 tragedies, only 3 end tragically. So what I'm suggesting is that this play that I admire so much, and that I suppose many of you admire so much too, is not particularly typical of Greek tragedy at all. It is one immensely great tragedy, and because it is so great, many of us somehow assume that all the others may have been somewhat like it. Well, as long as I disagree with Nietzsche, let me go a little further. And let me say, I've made some snide remarks about Aristotle. I'm now finding fault with Nietzsche. The implication that I want to leave with you is not that I am very wise and that Aristotle and Nietzsche were very foolish, but rather that here are very, very, very great thinkers, and that even very, very, very great thinkers sometimes make mistakes, and that one should not be so awed by one's own admiration for them and respect for them that one doesn't critically rethink their positions. Nietzsche supposes that tragedy died of optimism and rationalism, and thinks that Euripides was more optimistic and rationalist than his two great predecessors. And this seems to me quite false. Here I agree with Aristotle that Euripides was really the most tragic of the poets, but not necessarily for the same reasons as Aristotle. First of all, I don't think that Euripides was the most rationalistic and the most optimistic. I would be prepared to argue, I don't want to stretch out this lecture too long, and some of these things we can take up in the discussion, but I would be prepared to argue that if one has to use such not very happy terms as optimism and rationalism, they apply to Aeschylus far more than to Euripides. I think that Aeschylus believed that if people used their reason well to design the right kinds of institutions that allowed for proper compromise of important issues, there was no need for tragedy and catastrophe. He didn't think that that made the tragedies and the catastrophes that actually had occurred any more tragic. He did not share the typically modern mistake of thinking that tragedy has to be inevitable. He realized, Aeschylus realized, rightly, that precisely what is evitable, precisely what was so unnecessary, precisely what is so wasteful, precisely what people needn't and shouldn't have done and should have known better than to do, is doubly tragic, is doubly poignant in its tragedy. So he did have the optimism and the rationalism, if one must use those words, they're Nietzsche's words, I wouldn't otherwise choose them. He did believe that if people used their reason right, tragic outcomes could be avoided. While in Euripides, we do indeed occasionally find a hypertrophy, an abundant overgrowth of dialectical fireworks and rational argument. But I think the upshot is just about always the same, that after people have reasoned brilliantly, they do the unreasonable thing. In other words, what we find is a deep despair of reason, that reason isn't really what motivates people, and that after reasoning, reason still fails people, and they do the stupid thing. And so I think that Euripides was deeply disillusioned and a man in despair. This has something to do, I suppose, with the situation in which they lived. Aeschylus was one of the people who fought at Marathon, and probably also again at Salamis, definitely at Marathon in 490, maybe at Salamis 10 years later, defeated the Persians, was full of what a few determined people could do if they acted well in turning back a great threat, a great moral victory, a great flowering of civilization made possible by it, while Euripides lived through the Peloponnesian War, which was a stupid and immoral war of which he violently disapproved, of which he felt that it brutalized his people and that moreover the people of Athens were losing progressively, and the more they were losing it, the more brutally did they behave, and so his despair to us needs little explanation because it seems so congenial. And the more he despaired, the more he moved toward tragicomedy. Nietzsche was quite wrong in thinking that the death of tragedy comes from optimism and rationalism. On the contrary, what tragedy dies of is precisely despair, loss of faith in reason, loss of optimism, deep disillusionment. In conclusion, look once more at the story of Oedipus. To some of us, I suppose this is prototypically tragic material, because after all, we all know that one of the greatest tragedies ever written was written about it. I would say it's about as unpromising material for a tragic poet as one could find. And if Sophocles hadn't brought off this veritable miracle of writing such a great tragedy about it, we would say, well, this is material about which one could write a comedy, but not a tragedy. It would really be easier to write a comedy about this material than a tragedy. Particularly if one makes the mistake that Francis Ferguson, to my knowledge, pioneered, and that was picked up by Bernard Knox and others, namely the notion that Oedipus appears on the stage with a telltale limp. Some people think this was a discovery. It seems to me that this is really particularly uninsightful and shows a deep lack of understanding for the whole plot. If you think that this man limps around all the time and has scars on his feet and whatnot, then we are led straight into John Barth's novel Giles Goat Boy, which perhaps some of you have read, which contains a long parody of the Oedipus material, in which Oedipus is finally asked how playing footsie, but when a fellow goes to bed with me, it isn't his big toe I want to see. Well, if you make that particular mistake, the whole thing really becomes grotesque and funny. But now, what makes it possible material for a tragedy? What is the sort of thing that tragedy depends on, and that in our time is perhaps being lost and makes for the abundance of tragicomedy, which Euripides pioneered, and black comedy? The difference between comedy and tragedy is not in the plot, it's not in the story material, it's not in the ending, and it certainly doesn't mean that comedy depends on a more cheerful attitude. On the contrary, comedy depends on the deepest kind of disillusionment and cynicism, but what tragedy depends on is making of Oedipus, to go back to the beginning of this lecture, not a ridiculous figure, not a pompous, cocksure, hollow kind of person. If you make that of him, the whole thing becomes comic. The whole thing depends, for its tragic effect, on his being the first of men and a model of nobility. And when people become so disillusioned that they think that people just aren't noble, that everybody is hollow, that nobody deserves admiration and respect, that when you come right down to it, everybody stinks, then they cannot have tragedy anymore. Because tragedy, unlike comedy, depends on much more faith in man. It does not depend, as some people have argued, in faith in gods or religion or anything of the sort. Far from it. But tragedy, I think, does depend in taking seriously man's noblest aspirations. And when that disappears, then tragedy dies. Thank you.
Dr. Kaufmann, just to take last things first, a couple of your remarks on comedy. I think of Karl Marx's definition of comedy as a merry farewell to the past, and W.H. Auden's remarks upon defining comedy, among other things, as an act of anger at our common fate and our destiny of death, and at the same time a sort of exaltation of acceptance. And I've never thought of comedy before as a result of despair and a loss of faith in reason. And I'm thinking, for example, of the comedy in Mozart and the comedy in Shakespeare's The Tempest, which seems so very, very affirmative. If you don't mind departing from your analysis of tragedy for a moment, I'd like to hear you to respond to the apparent contradiction between some of these extremely affirmative reflections on comedy and your apparently negative ones.
My remarks about comedy are, of course, prompted, first of all, by what happened in Greece. Now, whether they have applicability beyond that is an entirely pertinent question. Let's come to that in a moment. But we do find, well, first of all, we should keep in mind, because this is very often forgotten, that Aeschylus and Sophocles, as well as Euripides, of course, didn't, properly speaking, write trilogies, but they wrote units of 4 plays, of which the last one was a satyr play, so that they were all able to write farcical plays that made people roll in the eyes with laughter. In the case of Aeschylus, we don't have one of these. In the case of Sophocles, we have a fragmentary one. So they could all do that. But now what we find in Euripides is a somewhat new genre. We have tragicomedies. Alcestis is one, Ion is another, and about some others there is debate as to whether they were meant to be comical or whether they were meant to be tragical. And first of all, what I want to suggest, and what is perhaps the least controversial aspect of my remarks about comedy, is that this particular switch in Euripides is not inspired by a more rationalist and optimistic attitude, but rather by despair. Now let's take a big jump to Shakespeare. It seems to me, on the whole, from my admittedly limited knowledge of literature and of comedy in particular, that we don't have comedies that compare with the greatest tragedies. I think, on the whole, Shakespeare's comedies, to my mind, are not in the same class with Hamlet and Lear. They may be very good theater, they may be very enjoyable. Many of you will have a different taste here. I think we don't really so far have comedies that quite compare with the great tragedies. But now let us look at some of Shakespeare's comedies. Some of Shakespeare's comedies very definitely are what you might call tragicomedies or black comedies, Measure for Measure, Troilus and Cressida. And these seem to me to be, if possible, even more disillusioned, even more desperate than the tragedies that he wrote at the same time. They seem to me sort of to be the ultimate in disillusionment. Now, the one that you mentioned is The Tempest, and The Tempest is, to my mind, a particularly hard play to understand. It certainly isn't particularly representative of comedy in general. It has been classified traditionally as a comedy. I suppose there are at least some scenes in it that are rather funny, but it is a very odd kind of a comedy, and I don't frankly quite know what to make of it. I admit that. I am puzzled by what I am supposed to think about Caliban. I know what I do think about him, but I don't know what Shakespeare wanted me to think or feel about him. When you see the play, as I have seen it, with a bad Prospero and a good Caliban, I mean a bad actor as Prospero and a good actor as Caliban, the whole play comes apart, and clearly he didn't mean it that way. Then you identify entirely with Caliban and think of Prospero as this wicked colonialist. Now, I don't think it was meant quite that way, but it is a puzzling play, and I wouldn't like to take my stand on that one in particular. If you turn to George Bernard Shaw's comedies, they don't make my point. Those comedies are more the sort of thing, I suppose, that Nietzsche thought of, only it doesn't apply to the ancient Greeks. They are very rationalistic, I think, and optimistic. But in some of Shakespeare's comedies, as I think in some of the Greek ones, you find a very deep despair, as you do again in some comedies in our time, such as those, I don't know whether you call them comedies, of Beckett or Ionesco, which have the kind of spirit that I was talking about, that's soaked in despair.
Next question, please. Could you take the microphone so we can all hear your question? It's just
It's not a very long walk. If it's very short, I'll repeat it for you if you like.
Okay. Would you equate loss of faith in reason with loss of faith in man?
Would I equate loss of faith in reason with loss of faith in man? No, I wouldn't. I brought up the loss of faith in reason only because Nietzsche had associated, and other people since Nietzsche have echoed, parroted him by associating the death of tragedy with loss of faith in reason. And here, obviously, one could lose faith in reason but not in man. This would be possible. What I am saying is that you do find in Euripides clearly an enormous intellectual interest in different forms of argument. But this does not go together with any strong faith in reason. He lets people go through these arguments, and in the end, they're somehow quite ineffectual. Nor, let me just add one thing, nor do I find in Euripides somehow a total loss of faith in man. Now in English, man has certain sexist overtones which are quite appropriate here, and one might say that Euripides, though he had the reputation, quite unjustly, of a woman hater, it seems to me more nearly lost his faith in man than in woman. And we find in Euripides, as in some of the other Greek playwrights, in the middle of a civilization that was quite sexist and quite anti-woman in many ways, we find that some of the most glorious figures in Greek tragedy, some of the most admirable are women, and some of the most despicable are men.
Professor Kaufmann, I would like to ask you another question concerning a point which you made, a philosophical point in your lecture, in which you turned over so many things to which we've been accustomed. Now, you used the expression radical insecurity of man, and Oedipus as a dramatic presentation of it. Now, in a way, this statement runs counter the spirit of very much of philosophy, particularly classical philosophy, particularly the father of modern philosophy, Descartes. For so many people, almost to the extent it is in Descartes, there is this identification of philosophy with a quest for certainty. Now, my question is, if so, do you see any dimension in which man may find at least partial, at least limited security or certainty? In what direction to search for it? And secondly, if it can be at best only partial, what would be the philosophical, ethical, and social implications of this situation?
This question is very congenial. I do indeed see, and this is one of the big points of my book on tragedy and philosophy, I do indeed see an opposition here between tragedy and much philosophy. And in this I side with the tragic poets against certain philosophers. And if Descartes was on the side where you put him, and I think you're probably right where you did put him, then I am on the side of Sophocles against Descartes. Now, this is, if some of you should sympathize with me, which perhaps a few of you do on this point and feel that perhaps I'm right, it's not very difficult to be right about that after what has happened to my generation. to be convinced of man's radical insecurity when one has, as I have done, grown up in Germany in the 20s and 30s and then lived through Auschwitz and through Hiroshima and so forth, doesn't take any very great brilliancy or any very great wisdom. My generation has been hit over the head with man's radical insecurity. And this certainly inspires second thoughts about the war between the philosophers and the tragic poets that begins perhaps with Heraclitus. Certainly we find it in Plato's Republic. And to the extent to which there is this opposition, I am very clearly finding more wisdom in some of the tragic poets than I find in some of the philosophers. Obviously, I mean, you are not suggesting any such thing, but somebody might misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that therefore all philosophy is useless, far from it. But on this particular point, it seems to me that some of the philosophers have been quite insufficiently aware of how little certainty we can have. Now, as for the moral and social implications of that, that's too big a question, I think, to address myself to in detail in answer to this question, unless somebody wants to follow it up and make it a little more precise. But again, it's a congenial question and one that strikes me as terribly important, and I have tried to deal with ethical and social questions in my book Without Guilt and Justice in an attempt to work out an answer to this sort of question. But that's very difficult and very complicated, and I don't know how to sum that up in a few well-chosen sentences. There are two people on the way to microphone, so let's wait a moment.
That person is on the way out. I have a question. I want to emphasize that this is an open question because it may sound otherwise like a loaded one. The point that you made towards the conclusion of your lecture to the effect that it's tragedy which depends upon a certain kind of optimism seemed possibly in contradiction, well, could be reconciled with the 4 of the 5 points that you made about Oedipus. But if I understood your 5th point correctly, it doesn't seem so easy to reconcile it with that point. That is, if I understood you correctly, you were saying as your 5th point that the Oedipus tragedy raised certain fundamental and searching questions about the nature of justice. And I'm wondering how you would bring together. Have I made clear what an apparent contradiction between those two is? That is, it seems to me that if the questions about justice are that fundamental and searching, then is that really consistent with the kind of optimism that tragedy requires? And I'm wondering, could I add something to that? It doesn't really put a question mark at the end, but does the solution to that apparent contradiction possibly have something to do with the fact that contrary to the way we may read the play now with our preconceptions and misconceptions perhaps about the role of the gods and fate and so forth, does the answer to the way out of that apparent contradiction possibly have something to do with the fact that in a sense Oedipus's tragedy is his own tragedy, that is the result of not of mere accident or something which does not seem to be directly his fault or something that he consciously does, but that within the frame of these various events of killing his father and so forth, which he's not conscious of, he himself defines the conditions which condemn him.
I confess that I quite fail to see any apparent contradiction. Now, the word optimism I'm unhappy about. I am the one who introduced it here. Nietzsche is the one who introduced it into the discussion in his book, The Birth of Tragedy. And I don't much like it in this context. But I did speak of optimism in the sense that somebody might feel that human nobility simply is not possible. And one might say it takes a certain faith in man, a very limited faith, to believe that some people sometimes, albeit rarely, do achieve genuine nobility. Now, one can believe, as I'm afraid I do believe, that most people have terribly little nobility, that most people are petty and cruel and dreadful. One can believe all that. One doesn't have to have any rosy 19th century faith in human virtue. And one can still believe, as I, for example, do believe, that it is possible now and then for a rare human being to achieve exceptional nobility, and that this really does happen, and that there are some people to whom one can point who have exemplified that. Now, if one has that kind of faith, I see no apparent contradiction between that on the one hand and having, as I also have, deep misgivings, doubts about justice, even feeling, as I do feel, that the very notion of justice, the very notion of somebody deserving some fate, is a confused notion and one that under philosophical analysis comes apart. That also I happen to believe. Now, I do not think that from that it follows at all that there's no connection between what we do and the consequences, and that everything that happens is pure chance. Obviously not. Obviously, what happens to Oedipus is the result of the sort of thing that he does. If you take somebody for whom I have enormous admiration, now living, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, various things that have happened to him have been very directly connected with things that he has done. That he was sent to the camps had something to do with something that he had done. That he has recently been kicked out of his country had something to do with what he had done. From that it doesn't follow that he deserved what happened to him. That he had cancer perhaps had nothing in particular to do with anything that he had done, and certainly one can't say, so far as I can see, that he deserved that. In other words, questions about justice, it seems to me, are something quite different. They are questions about what a human being deserves and what our analysis of the concept of desert should be. That is something quite different from whether we think that a human being can achieve nobility.
Yes, I see we're to some extent we're talking slightly across purposes. Perhaps I could get at the point if I asked then, could you clarify a bit more what you mean by a questioning of justice in terms of who is responsible for the injustice? Because what I thought you might be getting at was that Oedipus is a questioning of whether the world itself is just, of whether the system that Oedipus, well, no, that's the wrong implications, of whether the frame of things that Oedipus is in is just.
I don't believe that Sophocles believed any more than the author of the book of Job did, that people get what they deserve and that they deserve what they get. This strikes me as a very shallow and repugnant notion that's worthy of Job's friends, who are legion even in our time, but one that is not really worthy of a tragic poet or a philosopher. Now, I conceive of justice as being very closely allied to the notion of desert. And I am well enough read on that subject to realize that some people redefine justice and understand it quite differently. But I understand both distributive justice and retributive justice as attempts to give people what they deserve. Distributive justice to give them the good things they deserve, retributive justice to give them the bad things they deserve, and I am against both. Well, if you want to say something more, please do, but then somebody else is waiting.
Yes, I'm not disagreeing with anything that you're saying there. I'm just trying to clarify this point. Could one say then, as a clarification of what you were saying about tragedies depending upon, and I've insisted upon the qualification, a kind of optimism, that optimism, quote unquote, does not mean then the optimism that in the end everyone gets what he deserves.
Well, obviously, I don't have any such faith, and I think it makes no sense to suppose that everybody gets what he deserves. I've made it clear what I mean by optimism in quotes is that there's a possibility of human nobility, and certainly not that everybody gets what he deserves. Yes?
Professor, I'm just beginning to learn the Greek tragedies, and I know even less about Nietzsche, but I do have, one thing did crop up in my mind as you were speaking about his opinions on the death of tragedy, and I wrote it down, and I said, do you think that Nietzsche's opinions regarding the death of tragedy are based solely on his thoughts of what he thinks tragedy should be, rather than what the Greeks thought of as tragedy, and that his opinion is perhaps based on a view of history in hindsight? And is this perhaps why present-day productions of the Greek tragedies may seem rather misguided?
Was the subject of this question, I didn't understand all the words, Nietzsche?
Nietzsche's
Yes, right.
opinion
In that
regarding
case, I think I followed that.
Yeah.
I have translated Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. I think it is an interesting work. I think there are some brilliant ideas in it. On the whole, I think it is of Nietzsche's major works, perhaps one of the least major, perhaps the least admirable. And it is a book that is colored very much, as he himself admitted later on, by his experience of Richard Wagner's music. And he read into it, into the fate of Greek tragedy, some of the things that were happening in the 19th century in Germany. And he thought that tragedy had died in Greece of some attitudes similar to some that he found in the Germany of his time. And I am suggesting that this somehow is not a good reading of what happened in Athens in the 5th century, and that what really happened was something rather different, of which I gave a somewhat detailed account.
Okay, thank you.
And I don't think that Nietzsche would necessarily have been terribly distressed with this particular criticism I offered when he published a second edition of his book in 1886. He prefixed to it an attempt at a self-criticism, which is quite remarkable, and what he tried to salvage from the book mainly was some very different aspects of it, namely some reflections on the relation of art to science, which are very profound and very interesting, but not really so much the sort of thing that I have just criticized.
Dr. Kaufmann, do you see man's human condition as being comic or tragic?
I didn't understand.
Do you see man's human condition as being comic or tragic?
Yes. Whether I see man's human condition as comic or tragic, what I was trying to say, but I appreciate this opportunity to say it more clearly, is that this depends on your mood and point of view, whether you see it as comic or tragic. It depends on how you feel, and I think if you see it as comic, you are likely to be, at the time when you see it as comic, in deeper despair than when you see it as tragic. It seems to me that as long as you see it as tragic, you still somehow sympathize more with it and haven't thrown up your hands in despair. And when it seems to you comic, you are somehow more alienated, more withdrawn from it, more desperate. And I suppose most of us here know both experiences of sometimes feeling, but this is really despair, that it is just comic. What else can one say? And when we are more involved and somehow sympathize more with the suffering, it seems more tragic. I'll make one more observation on Shakespeare's comedies. One of the things that bothers me about many of the comedies is that it seems to me that the comedies are much more cruel in attitude than other tragedies. And I very often cannot muster the necessary cruelty to laugh at the sufferings of various characters that's called for in comedy. In tragedy, you're allowed to empathize with them. In comedy, you're supposed to laugh your head off as somebody suffers hideously. So comedy, I say again, is not necessarily particularly optimistic. And to connect with a question just asked a few minutes ago, the idea that in the end everybody gets exactly what he deserves, or what the playwright or the audience might think he deserves, is much more regularly found at the end of a comedy than at the end of a tragedy. Yes?
I'm going back to the question of the distinction between tragedy and comedy, and your suggestion that tragedy is distinguished by its assertion of a faith in the human capacity for reason and nobility. Now it seems to me that unjustly deprives comedy of its capacity for asserting the same thing, and I don't see the Shakespearean comedies as cruel on the whole. I see the, say, As You Like It, Twelfth Night, as finally asserting the human capacity for rationality, serenity, nobility. And I would suggest that possibly a more appropriate term for the kind of comedy you mean is satire. The more pessimistic, the more cruel comedy, the comedy that's disillusioned, disabused.
I think I'll make my peace with you and partially accept what you say. It's very much in the spirit of my own remarks to say, as I have not said so far and shall now say, that it's a mistake to suppose that all comedies are of one kind, that just as I've emphasized, that even Greek tragedies are of many different kinds, and if you add to that Shakespearean tragedies and French and German tragedies and Spanish tragedies, you have a wealth of different types, and so in comedy too. I did wrong earlier, and some are suggesting that certain generalizations hold of all comedies. They don't. There are many different kinds of comedies, as I admitted previously. Some of the things I said don't apply particularly to George Bernard Shaw's comedies, and they may not apply to many other comedies. They apply to some comedies, and perhaps have special relevance to the sort of thing that I was talking about earlier with the Greeks.
Professor Kaufmann, I'd like to return to the quote. You quoted the passage from Oedipus Rex, whereby Oedipus decrees that his father's murderer should be barred from the doors of the people, that he should not be spoken to, and that if Oedipus by chance should take the man into his own family, receive similar punishment. I believe at the end of this quote, you said that perhaps we would be surprised at how rash Oedipus is in his decree and how unjust he is. My question is, how can you be surprised at, or why should you think that we would be surprised when in fact this is what we do to alleged criminals ourselves? We virtually refuse to allow them to return to some possibility of happiness and achievement. We don't let them enter into our lifestyles, and we don't let them enter our houses. Could you comment on this, please?
Yes, if one wants to protest the inhuman and cruel way in which society treats criminals, there are many ways of doing it, by writing about it at great length. There are two ways of doing it somewhat more poignantly. One is the one Sophocles chooses, to have somebody make a speech of whom we know he is it. And he says all these things, and then we have the feeling now, if he had thought of that, if he had realized it was he, would he have said those things? And this somehow immediately transcends the particular situation. The other way is to think of the words of a rabbi, Hillel, an older contemporary of Jesus, who said, "Do not judge a man till you have stood in his shoes." Now that's good counsel that one should ask oneself, and this is something that one learns also from Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. One should ask oneself when one feels indignant about somebody else's behavior, now, how would I have acted in his place? And two, well, even if I hadn't acted that way, if now I were in his place, would this make sense to treat him that way? And what is ingenious about the dramatic irony of Sophocles is that instead of giving us a lecture about this sort of thing, he has a man eloquently pronounce a curse, and the audience knows that he is cursing himself. And this, I think, is a good dramatic device to awaken in us doubts about justice.
Professor Kaufmann, in Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, I believe he said that the destiny, the fate of Oedipus came upon him not because of justice or injustice of man's condition, but because he overstepped the natural bounds of what it is to be a human being in solving the riddle of etc. And at the same time, you said that a hero is not a normal thing to be found in Greek tragedy. So perhaps these two views support each other.
I couldn't hear the second thing very well. I missed a few words. The first one is that Oedipus' catastrophe comes on him because he overstepped the bounds of what a human being should be or do, right? And what was the second point?
At the same time, you said that in Sophocles' plays, a hero is an unusual phenomenon. There are only two in his plays. Therefore, perhaps these two views confirm each other.
But it seems to me that the way Nietzsche treats particular tragedies is a scandal. It's a scandal that is common in philosophy, and it's one thing that made me write that book, Tragedy in Philosophy, because I was so distressed by it. Here Nietzsche writes a book about the birth of tragedy, and he doesn't discuss in it, really, a single tragedy. Not the Oedipus tragedy either. When he writes about Oedipus, he does what I started protesting against without naming names, namely he talks about it as if the play that was written in 425 and the play that was written in 406 were one literary work, which they are not. He runs them together. This is the only play by Sophocles that he discusses at all, and he doesn't really discuss either one of them. He contrasts that with Prometheus, which is the only play by Aeschylus that he discusses at all. The only other play that he, I think, as much as mentions is Euripides' Bacchae, and what he says about that, I think, is even worse. This is a very high-handed way to talk about tragedy in general without talking about any tragedy in particular. And I think he doesn't go quite as far as you did a moment ago in saying that he is the only hero to be found in Sophocles. That would be, I think, sillier than what Nietzsche does actually say. Surely Electra is a heroine, surely Antigone is one, surely Philoctetes is one, and so forth. So there isn't only one. Now, the interest in the incest motif that you find in Nietzsche's writing about it is again partly influenced by allusions to Wagner and the birth of Siegfried out of the incest of his parents. And he wants to make certain clever remarks about Wagner in that connection. It really seems to me not to be a model of what good literary criticism should be. There are in Nietzsche, in that book and in his other works, brilliant insights of a psychological nature and also into literary works, but it seems to me that the way he treats the Oedipus story here is really very irresponsible and rather a model of how one should not do it. Should we take one more question?
Still game?
Yeah, sure.
One more question, perhaps?
Possibly because I'm quite familiar, I believe, with H.D.F. Kitto's interpretation.
With whose? Kitto's?
Kitto's.
Yes.
Which I believe is seeing Sophocles' Oedipus as the story of a man who insists on staying a man and blinds himself so that he may accept the responsibility for the actions, even though one could say that fate had woven these about him in an inescapable way. And I've been sitting mostly this evening trying to mesh this with your own viewpoint, which has more to do with justice. But I see justice as a social activity between men, and I see Oedipus' activity as an introspective activity. He knew himself. He had stood in his own shoes. And he still insists on taking the total responsibility for these actions upon himself, and he's not blinded by anyone else. He blinds himself. Can you somehow weave these two themes together, or do you have to reject one to accept the other?
Well, I'll say a number of things about it. First of all, Kitto is discussed in my book about this and about other points, and I won't address myself particularly now to his views. Secondly, I don't think that the theme of justice was that prominent in my lecture. Maybe somewhat more than half of my lecture, maybe almost 2/3, dealt with the play, and in that part I stressed, among other themes, 5, one of which had to do with doubts about justice. So it was just one point of very many, which perhaps has gained a little more prominence now in the discussion, owing to some questions asked about that, and I welcome that. I'm not unhappy about that at all. That is an important theme, but I'm very far from claiming that it is more than at most 1 of 5. There are many, many other aspects. Now, of course, I myself said that it made quite a difference whether he blinds himself or whether it is the servants of Laius who do it. Now, if the servants of Laius, the father, do it, as apparently in Euripides, then you might not necessarily suppose that it had very much to do with justice. You might think that it was revenge, that the loyal cohorts of the old king who has been killed now avenge their dead king. When Oedipus, the wisest of men, decides to blind himself, somehow revenge seems to be out of the question. It seems to be self-punishment. And there is a suggestion that somehow, in some sense or other, he deserves it. Now, one way of simply getting around it and not taking this whole problem very seriously is to invoke poetic justice. That's such a weasel word, right? We can say it's poetic justice that all the play through he had his 2 eyes and he didn't see, and Tiresias, who was blind, the seer, came and he could see but was blind, and then when Oedipus finally does see, he blind himself, and it's just on the poetic level. But I think we also ask ourselves, among many other things, I'm not saying that this is the crux of the play, it isn't, but one thing we also ask ourselves is, was it right for Jocasta to hang herself? Is it right for Oedipus to blind himself? Was this a reasonable, right thing of him to do? Now, maybe you think that's silly of me because you think that everybody knows that Oedipus blinded himself. That's just a fact, and I'm saying it's not a fact at all. In Homer, he didn't. And it is something that Sophocles has him do. And I don't think the audience had any way of telling, till it actually happened, that he was going to do it. Maybe some of them had heard that particular tradition and were wondering, will he or won't he? And to many others, this must have been a total surprise and nothing like it would ever have occurred to them. In any case, it's an enormous shock. One performance that I've seen was in Hölderlin's translation with Karl Orff's music, and the moment when he stepped out with blood running down, Orff's music somehow made this one of the most blood-curdling moments I've ever seen on the stage. It's a horrible moment, but then you also, among other things, think about it, and you ask yourself, does this make sense? Is this in some sense a just act? Is this somehow morally fitting? Is it morally right? Is this somehow deserved? And when I speak of doubts about justice, I meant just that. It simply awakens doubts. I didn't mean that this necessarily leads you to Walter Kaufmann's conclusions about justice. Not necessarily at all. But it does, I think, upset one's smug assurance that one knows what is right and wrong, that one knows what is good and evil. It seems to me one of the terribly, terribly upsetting things about Oedipus Tyrannus is that, like other great tragedies, it hits you like a cataclysm, and afterwards you are not so sure of yourself anymore. And your radical insecurity is not only that you realize, right now I'm sitting pretty, right now I'm well off, but that doesn't mean that my condition will be at all similar to this tomorrow or a year hence, but it also fakes up your supposedly certain knowledge. There are all sorts of things of which you think you can be sure, and then you look at Oedipus, the wisest of men, and you say to yourself, well, these things that I feel so sure about, perhaps they aren't so. Perhaps I don't really have a right to be so sure about these things. And this shakes you up. And this, I'm suggesting, is one of the great things about some of the greatest tragedies. Thank you.